Maine, August 3rd, Peaks, Kenny State Park. We arrived after a long drive to Peaks Kenny State Park with our camper, and we are staying here at the campground. We are driving to the Joe Mary campground tomorrow before my sister and her husband drop us off at the start of the 100-mile wilderness. It was an okay campground, but it was very crowded. We went down to the pond to take a dip in the water and returned to our camper to eat our dinner. Dave had made a powder pudding for dessert as we watched our shows on his Kindle Fire before going to bed. August 4th, Joe Mary Campground. We arrived at KI Joe Mary, a logging area, to set our food cache at the halfway point of the 100-mile wilderness. We drove the dirt logging road to where the AT crosses the road and went into the woods to hide our supply cache. We had our supplies inside a green military ammo box, and Dave had a folding shovel that he used to dig into the hard Maine ground. He did manage to bury the 5 boxes. While he was doing this, someone with a truck drove over to where we had parked on the side of the road. I went out to the road and told the man that I had just gone into the woods to pee. We did not want him to know that we were burying our supplies here. He told me that I had to move our camper because the logging trucks come through here and I better get moving down the road. We drove to Johnson Brook Campsite, a primitive campsite that we had booked at KI Joe Mary. It was $44 for the night here and had a covered picnic table, a metal fire ring, and an outhouse. The campsite was the most pristine campsite that we had ever stayed out at and was alone in the Maine wilderness right next to the brook. We sat under the picnic table cover, and a thunderstorm had come through quickly before we had our dinner. We then played some cards and went into the camper for the night. August 5th, a Ball Bridge south to Herd Brook lean-to. We left our nice campsite, it was a great camping experience, and drove over to the town of Munson and parked in the AT parking lot at the start of the 100-mile wilderness. My sister, her husband with her daughter, will be picking us up and driving us to Abel Bridge in the town of Maine August. It was a hot day, a shocking experience when we got out of their nice air-conditioned car and onto our first steps into the 100-mile wilderness. We had all seen a moose near a pond on our drive up here. It was a great experience for all. We reached the sign for the 100-mile wilderness, a short distance down the trail from the road. It reads, "It is 100 miles south to the nearest town at Monson. There are no places to obtain supplies or get help until Monson. Do not attempt unless you have a minimum of 10 days' supplies and are fully equipped." This is the longest wilderness section of the entire AT, and its difficulty should not be underestimated. MATC, the Maine Appalachian Trail Club. We had met a weird male hiker sitting on the side of the trail that was heading in the same direction as us. He told us that he had lost his water filter, his hat, and his can opener. Later, he had passed us and was dropping cigarettes, butts, and candy wrappers on the trail. We had gone 1 mile on the trail before we hit our first large boulders on the trail. We reached Herb Brook Lean-To Shelter. It was an old log-style lean-to. We found a nice place to set our tent up on our first night in the 100-mile wilderness and cooked our first homemade dehydrated meal on this adventure. I was already really hungry and was worried that I had not brought enough food for this backpacking trip. It was a warm night in the tent, and I was getting a feeling like this trip we are undertaking might be too much for us. Maybe I will feel better in the morning. August 6th, Herd Brook lean-to south to Rainbow Stream Campsite. We woke up at 5:30 this morning to a light rain, not very encouraging. The coals that we had in the cooking stove last night that Dave had dumped into a dirt hole was still hot this morning. During the night, I had kept smelling smoke, but I had thought that it had come from the fire ring near the shelter. I went to the pond to get some water and saw a moose on the other side of the pond, and I saw a loon flying overhead and heard some loons call. How awesome is that? We packed down and headed back onto the trail, and it was a hot and humid day. I found some blueberries as we were starting our climb up to Rainbow Ledges. They were so sweet, best ever so far, and I smacked my lips together in their glory. The climb up was rocky, and we reached the ledges. There would have been a view here of Katahdin, however it was all fogged in. We reached a trail sign here and found out that we had already did 2.5 miles from the shelter and that it was another 5.2 miles to Rainbow Stream Campsite, our destination for the day. We reached Rainbow Lake, where we had stopped for lunch and could hear a thunderstorm in the distance. The same hiker had passed us again on the trail, and then we would pass him as he sat down to smoke a cigarette. We are trying to move faster down the trail so that we can get some distance from him. I am calling him the Impassable. We reached Rainbow Stream Campsite and found a nice site. I have my weather radio with me, and we had set up our tarp over the tent, as rain is forecasted for tonight. We went down to the pond and filtered some water and had got into the water. The water was ice cold, so I could only do a dip in the water. The ice water felt very good on my hot and sore feet after our hike today. I woke up during the night to the sounds of something being dragged through the woods, like a bear had got our food bag that Dave had hung up off a tree branch that we thought a bear could not reach. I grabbed the flashlight and looked outside the tent, and I could see our food bag and the food bag of another hiker that had set up next to us, and they both were still okay. I was not sure if I had just dreamt it or if something big did walk through the campsite. I did not fall back to sleep until around 1:30 in the morning. August 7th, Rainbow Stream Campsite, south to unknown campsite near Crescent Pond. We woke up to a beautiful morning, a breezy and cooler day. We went down to the pond and listened to some loon calls near the pond as we ate our breakfast. We got onto the trail and walked through a nice rocky area with a small waterfall. It was a beautiful day, and I was feeling lucky to experience this section of the trail. The breeze was still blowing, and the temperatures went into the 80s, but with no humidity, it was still a nice day and very comfortable. We crossed a log bridge to Rainbow Stream Shelter. Hikers had left trashed here under the shelter. We passed the Impassable Man again, and we had known that he was ahead of us from all the cigarette butts that we had seen on the trail. We just cannot seem to get ahead of him, and he keeps stopping on the trail. A youth group had passed us, and then a Boy Scout group passed us. There are a lot of groups out here on the trail, which will mean a lot of full campsites. We walked along a very scenic area following Rainbow Stream and passed by some gorges and some more small falls before we turned away from the stream and reached Wadley Pond Road, a dirt road that was near the Pollywog Stream. We reached Pollywog Stream Campground, where we had planned to stay. It was in a nice pine forest. However, it is only 1:30 and way too early to set up camp for the night, so we decided to continue on the trail. We climbed up what felt like a 4,000-foot mountain, but it was only a 200-foot climb. We were getting tired and was looking for a place to set up camp, but we were still climbing with no good spot to set up at. We reached Crescent Pond and found a nice pine area on a hill overlooking the pond. It was not an official campsite. We located a nice spot for the tent, and Dave set up the tent here. It was getting windy, and there was a chance for rain tonight, so Dave put up the tarp over the tent. It was so windy now that he was having difficulty tying down the tarp over the tent. Somehow he did manage to secure it over the tent. We went to the pond and filtered some water. The pond water was warm, not cold like the streams were. After we settled in for the night, other hikers arrived and the area started to fill up with other tents. Yes, Impassable Man was here too. We just cannot seem to get away from him. August 8th campsite near Crescent Pond, south to Namaconta Stream, lean-to. I woke up to the sound of an owl. We went to the pond to filter more water and heard some loons. Today we had perfect weather, windy and sunny. We packed up and saw Impassable Man also breaking down. He was with some other female hikers telling them of his misfortune on the trail. The women had offered him some of their food. We moved quickly out of the campsite and was hoping to push out the miles today to get some distance from this hiker. Nessuntabunt Mountain was a hard climb up with a 1,500-foot gain in elevation, with a nice viewpoint up here of Katahdin Mountain and Nessuntabunt Lake below. We reached Wadley Stream Lean-To Shelter and stopped here to eat our lunch. It was a nice shelter. A memorial poster for a thru hiker named Buffalo Bob was in the shelter who had died near this shelter only 38 miles from Katahdin while trying to finish his third thru hike on the AT. I was hoping that I would find some trail magic food here, as I was really hungry, but no such luck. We crossed Namakanta Road, one of the dirt logging road that goes to the checkpoint that we went to when we arrived in Maine to drop off our supplies. We reached the beach of Namakanta Lake. It was a beautiful pond, and we took a dip in the cold water. It was very refreshing, an awesome experience. We finally reached Namakanta Stream Lean-To Shelter. The campsite was in a nice pine forest, and we had found a nice spot to set up our tent. I was feeling tired and I had blisters on my feet. We really pushed out the miles today. However, I was feeling like the hike today had lasted a lifetime. I had really enjoyed the nice weather, the blue skies, the pine forest, and the waves lapping over the sand at the lake. However, I was really hungry and ready for our meal today. We had a nice night as we listened to the owls around midnight. The temperatures had cooled down into the 40s. August 9th, Namakanta Stream. Lean-To south to Antlers Campsite. We woke to a great morning and was really moving pretty good today. We must finally have our trail legs. We pumped out the 4 miles to Potaiwajo Spring Lean-To. We found a beautiful large spring, best water on the trail so far, and filtered some water here. We ate our lunch inside the lean-to. We hiked another mile to Joe Mary Lake, a sandy beach with a beautiful view of the mountains with no development, and I got into the water. Dave just walked into the water up to his knees. It was ice cold. We had found some mussels in the water along the beach and cooked them up. They were delicious. We reached Antlers Campsite. It was in a nice red pine forest on a peninsula surrounded by a lake. We were early, around 3 o'clock, and I had listened to the weather radio. 70% chance of rain was forecasted for Saturday. We are scheduled to climb up over Whitecap Mountain that day, so we thought about pushing it up over Whitecap Mountain on Friday instead. There was only a 50% chance of rain instead of the 70% on Saturday. We set up camp and a large group arrived and set up near us. We should not have set up near the water. They were very loud and was talking about food, chicken, Thai food, and other types of food that we were not eating out here. I started to think of our extra food that we had buried at the halfway point. I do not like people around me. I like my solitude and the peace and quiet of the woods. Dave told me that we are part of the AT community out here, so I should get used to being part of it as if we were through hikers. August 10th, Antlers Campsite, south to our cache and stealth site. We woke to a great sunrise over the lake. The large family group was set up right behind us. It was because we had picked the peninsula, the most popular spot. We packed down and headed out onto the trail as the humidity came up with no wind with the clouds moving in. Back were the mosquitoes, and gone was the beautiful weather. The first 4 miles was hard on our way to Joe Mary Road. It was so humid out and there was no views during the climbs. I got 2 bites on the back of my neck, and the hiking was just pure torture. We crossed 2 stream crossings that Dave had seen on YouTube. They were high water streams that were waist height with a rope to hang onto as you crossed the fast-moving water. Well, we were lucky, as the water was very low, and we crossed them with no difficulty. We had seen talk about trail magic in the lean-to logbook by other hikers. We never look for trail magic, but this trip we were feeling depleted, and I had hopes for something at Joe Mary Road. Well, we reached Joe Mary Road, and there was no trail magic here. We reached Cooper Brook Lean-To and was going to eat our lunch here. However, there was a large youth group here, and some of the youths were terrorizing a chipmunk, so we just pushed on. We finally reached Joe Mary Road and had done 10 hard miles today. I had kept counting out left, right, as a meditating rhythm to get through to our destination. Dave had dug up our cache, and I had some refried beans on a taco shell with taco sauce, and Dave had can of cold Chef Boyardee's. It was so good. We set up camp, and we used a solar shower bag to take a shower in the woods on a small blue tarp. The water was cold, and I washed my hair. First time for this. August 11th, cache stealth site south to Pleasant River Lean-To. I had slept good last night, and we woke up and tried to hurry to get our cache buried again so that we could get moving onto the trail. This is our halfway point, and we have 50 miles to get to Monson and our camper. Our goal for today is to hike about 4.6 miles to the East Branch Pleasant River and then do the climb up to Whitecap Mountain tomorrow. We started out with a climb up to the Little Boardman Mountain at 2,000 feet, and it was the hardest 2,000-footer that we had ever done. It was hot and humid today, and I had a very heavy pack on after refilling it at the cache site. I think that I had overloaded it with too much food, and now I am paying for it. I was moving much slower than I was yesterday. Dave appeared upset because I was not keeping up with him, and he had to keep stopping. But I just could not go any faster today because of the weather and this heavy pack. We went over the East Branch Pleasant River, another high river crossing that was luckily not high, which was also low, but had large boulders that we had to get over and around. We reached the Pleasant River lean-to, where we had set up early at around 1 o'clock. We had picked a site near the trail with a large rock near us, and we went down to the pond and filtered some water. After I went for a swim in the water, it felt great after the hot day. I saw a green frog on a rock, and I guessed that we were disturbing it. It would jump off the rock and into the water, and then jump back up and back onto the same rock again. The sun was back out, and a nice breeze had picked up as we sat here in the pines at our tent. The weather radio had changed the weather on Saturday to 100% chance of rain. August 12th, Pleasant River lean-to south to Sydney Tappan campsite. Today will be our worst hiking day that we had ever experienced on the AT. We woke up early to try to beat the rain, heavy showers, and thunderstorms that was forecasted for today in the afternoon. We at least had hope to make it to the top of Whitecap Mountain, that is said to have the best view of Mount Katahdin. The rain had started shortly after we had got onto the trail. It was just a light rain at first at the lower elevation. It was very humid out, and we did not want to put on our rain gear yet. We reached Logan Brook lean-to at around 9:40, and a hiker was hunkered down in the shelter. He told us that he was taking a 0 day today due to the bad weather. We do not have the choice to take a 0 day as section hikers, as we had to stay on schedule to make it out on time and go back to work. The climb up to Whitecap Mountain after the shelter was very foggy, no visibility up here, and there was a breeze, which made it very chilly as our clothing was getting damp. The rain had started to come down heavy, and we had not yet got our rain gear on in time before we got soaked. I had to take off my wet shirt, and we found that the rain gear and the backpack covers was getting so wet that they were both hopelessly non-waterproof. We were getting more wet and very cold. We reached Hay Mountain and the rain had stopped. However, it was still cloudy, foggy, and chilly out. The forecast is for more rain during the night. We descended a little and then climbed up to West Peak Mountain. There was a nice stealth site here. However, we were out of water and needed to filter some for our meal, so we had to push on to the campsite. We reached Sydney Tappan campsite. We set up camp, soaked and cold. There was about an inch of rain in our boots, and all of our clothing was soaked. I wrote in my notebook, "If we die in this tent tonight from hypothermia, do not feel bad for us, because at least we were doing something that we loved and had dreamt on doing." Then I went to sleep. August 13th, Sydney Tappan campsite, south to the West Branch of the Pleasant River campsite. It had rained all night, and we woke up to a rainy morning. We packed down all our wet gear and headed out onto the wet trail. We were hiking in our wet and dirty clothing, and every step was just pure torture. I had nothing good to say about this day. We reached Carl A. Newhall lean-to shelter, where we sat and ate our lunch. We wanted to make West Branch of the Pleasant River campsite tonight. We had got onto the trail late today and had only done about 1.8 miles so far. Yesterday, we had done a lot of miles. We reached the West Branch of the Pleasant River, which was one of the rivers that Dave had seen on YouTube that was a difficult river crossing. So far, all the rivers and streams we crossed were low, and so was this one. The river was only up to our knees. A female caretaker was at the river after I had crossed it, and we watched Dave crossing the river. She said that she would never cross the river when it was over her waist. She would wait until the river went down. She told us that the weather for tomorrow was not good. More rain is expected. We found a nice site to set up our tent. The tent was damp, but not soaked, as the tarp had kept most of the rain off the tent last night. On a nice day, this area would have been very nice. However, the rain made it very unpleasant. The ground here is wet, and pine needles stuck onto everything. Everything we had was covered in mud and soaked, and we were soaked. We were in the tent by 5 o'clock, and it got dark at 8 o'clock. It was an awful 2 days out here, and it did not look any better for tomorrow. August 14th, west branch of the Pleasant River south to Chairback Gap lean-to shelter. It had rained all night again, and we woke up to another rainy morning to set down our tent. This is just beyond terrible. The climb up Chairback Mountain was super hard. Luckily, the rain had stopped. However, it was still misty out, which kept everything wet and damp. The rocks and boulders were very slippery, and it was a very hard 2,000-foot climb. We reached a rock slide that was a vertical climb up. It was very scary as these small and big rocks would roll under your feet, and it felt like you would slide down the mountain. It was like the rock slide climb that we went up on Cadden Mountain. Then came the hand-over-hand climb up over large rocks and boulders in this wet condition. We reached the top, and the view had opened up here for a moment. We stopped here to eat our lunch. This was the first nice view that we had had this trip with no rain, and we were amazed by the views of the distant mountains. Other hikers had warned us that the spring was dry on Chairback, but with all the rain, the spring was flowing nicely up here, and we were able to filter some water here. We reached Chairback Gap lean-to shelter and found a nice spot to set up our tent. It was sunny out now, and we were early here. We put our wet clothing and gear on a line that we tied between two trees. I hope that they are dry by morning. August 15th, Chairback Gap, lean-to south to Cloud Pond lean-to. We had woke up with several other tents that had set up next to us. It was a sunny morning, thank God for that. Luckily, some of our gear had dried a little as we had packed down and headed out onto the trail. We went to the shelter and found a dog near it. The dog ran away when I reached out to it. The dog belonged to the two male hikers in the shelter. We started our climb up right away after we got onto the trail up to Columbus Mountain. Next, we went up the mountain range of Columbus Mountain, with Third Mountain, followed by 3.5 Mountain, and then finally Fourth Mountain. They were all 2,000-foot mountains, and the range had several very difficult climbs with hand-over-hand climbing and descent over large boulders. The views were beautiful up here with a mostly cloudy sky, and the best thing about this day is that it is not raining. We are getting tired and worn out from this trip now, and I am ready to get out. The forecast for tonight is 100% chance of rain again. We reached Cloud Pond lean-to, which was 0.4 miles off the trail. It was a beautiful area in the pine next to the pond. We went down to filter water after setting up the tent, and a green frog was floating in the water next to us and watching us as we were filtering. Curious little thing. I was hoping that we would be alone tonight. However, as it was getting dark, two other hikers had set up right next to us. It was not like that. There was no other place in this area to set up their tent. We could hear them talking most of the night about food. We have a large tarp that we set up over our tent when it rains, so it is extended over each sides of the tent. The two hikers were not happy with how much space that we had took up and were complaining about it. Dave does not seem to mind having other hikers around us. It is a hiker community on the trail, and a lot of the hikers have been hiking with the same group most of the trail. I am not very social and like to enjoy the sounds of nature, not listening to other hikers. August 16th, Cloud Pond lean-to south to Wilson Valley, lean-to shelter. We woke up in Tent City. I got out of the tent and looked around us, and there were a lot of tents set up in this small pine area. I walked to the shelter and to use the privy and saw several more tents here too. This area was full. I like backpacking to get away from the noise and the crowds of regular state and national park campgrounds. The AT can be more crowded out here in the wilderness with through hikers, section hikers, and even 1 to 2 night backpacking outings in the 100-mile wilderness. There are many trails that come into the wilderness for a short backpacking trip, and the 100-mile wilderness is a very popular hiking area in Maine. We packed down and headed back out onto the trail. It is another hard and humid hiking day, and we are starting to get onto each other's nerves. We are stinky sore and tired, and the bugs are driving us nuts. The trail has been wet and we are slipping on the rocks. I am just ready to end this hike already. I listen to music on the trail over and over to get my mind off the endless hiking over this difficult and endless trail. The PUIs yesterday over 1,000-foot mountains was horrible. We could not even tell where the top of these mountains were. Dave was getting upset with the map and the trail. He kept thinking that we had reached the top of barren mountain ledges and the trail would level off. But it didn't. It just kept climbing up. We finally reached Barren Mountain that had a fire tower on it. However, you could not climb it, so we continued onto the ledges where the trail did level off a bit, and the ledges was scenic. However, the hiking was hard. We finally reached Long Pond Stream Lean-To and stopped here to eat our lunch before we continued on to Forge Long Pond Stream, another river crossing that Dave had seen on YouTube showing hikers crossing the water that was over their waist. Today it was low, and we were able to cross over on the rocks. We reached a dirt road with a big sign for Trail Magic. It was a nice painting with a moose and a mountain. We did not walk the extra mileage for the Trail Magic and crossed the road. We reached a rock slide area with big boulders, and then after a horrendous climb and descent, we finally reached Wilson Valley Lean-To Shelter. We had pumped a bottle of water from the stream. Dave had spilled the bottle onto the ground here, and he had dropped the bottle into the mud. Not one of his better moments. We set up our tent and our tarp, as again, it is supposed to rain again tonight. I am hoping for a good night's sleep after this hard hiking day. August 17th, Wilson Valley Lean-To South to Stealth Site near North Pond. It had rained all night on the tarp. Kudos to Dave for his ability at putting up the tarp and keeping us dry during the night. We had woke up to rain, and it is supposed to be clearing later today, and the water level is high. We have the Big Wilson Stream to cross today, which is the hardest river crossing in the 100-mile wilderness. We packed down in the rain and reached a mileage sign that showed us that we were still 10.4 miles to Maine Highway 15. We will not make it that far today. We crossed the Canadian Pacific Railroad tracks, and the rain had stopped, and now we had some blue skies before reaching Wilson Stream. We had to take off our boots and socks and had to cross the stream with our sneakers. There is a rope here. Again, this is the stream that Dave had seen on YouTube where the water was chest high, and the hikers had to cross the stream using the rope. Dave was fearing this crossing for weeks before the trip. Luckily, today, it was not that high and was only as high as our knees. We climbed up to Big Wilson Cliffs. The terrain here was surprisingly hard, with lots of very hard PUDs from the Barren Mountain to Monson. It was surprising because all of these were only 1,000-foot mountains, but they all had a lot of large rocks and slanted boulders with hand-over-hand climbing. We reached a beautiful waterfall that went through a rocky stream gorge before we reached North Pond, which actually was more of a swamp with a beaver dam. We found a nice flat area and decided to set up camp here. It was nice to be alone again, and that it is our last night on the trail. Many of our camping sites on this trip had been crowded, except for where we camped at the cache site. We had set down early enough to have some time to relax. We are happy to be close to the end of our hike on the 100-mile wilderness. We are tired, hungry, and we stink. However, we are glad that we did it. August 18th, Stealth Site near North Pond, south to Highway 15. We woke up to a sunny morning on our last day on the 100-mile wilderness. We hiked to Lehman Brook Lean-To Shelter for a short break. It is the last shelter in the 100-mile wilderness. I had taken my earplugs out and heard the sounds of traffic in the distance. I was always happy when we were away from the sound of traffic, but right now, it is great, as we are almost to our camper and the end of this long and hard backpack. I had loved Barren Ledges. It had very beautiful views. I loved all the different types of pine trees, moss, and the blueberries, which were delicious. Last night, I enjoyed the quiet of the woods and the babbling brook and the sunset over the pond this morning. I loved all the sounds of nature, the loons, the chipmunks, and the red squirrels. On our way out, we saw a red mouse running across the trail. I will remember the beaches, dipping in the ice-cold water, and the clams that we ate near the pond. The glory of hot oatmeal in the morning with a cup of coffee and the delicious homemade dehydrated meals that we had made prior to this adventure. The excitement of reaching the cache at the halfway point, taking a cold shower in the woods, and eating our cache food. I will also remember the rain and the wet clothing, and of being able to put on dry clothing and boots when we were able to dry them out on the sunny day. This is a trip of a lifetime, and I am happy to have been able to do it and to finish it a day early. We lost about 20 pounds on this hike, and we most likely will never spend 13 days in the woods again.